So on the behalf of Africa Business School, let me warmly welcome you. Thank you for coming on, and now the platform leaving to you.
Thank you very much, Professor. First of all, I would really like to thank you very much for your kind invitation. I really feel very honored to participate in the Voice of Research Excellence program and to have this chance to interact with this group of prominent scholars and researchers. Second, I would like also to congratulate Africa Business School for launching the PhD program, which I'm very confident will have a real added value, not only in the academic field, but also in the business markets. And I'm also hopeful that this program will bring a new model of research to our country, which brings together researchers with the practitioners along with policymakers to think in a collaborative way about new innovative ways to do business and to foster entrepreneurship and economic growth. Because honestly, for decades, the research, especially in our countries, remained really disconnected from reality. So we have, in one hand, researchers trying to solve hypothetical problems, while business practitioners and policymakers are struggling on a daily basis to find solutions to their real problems on the other hand. So, and with no bridges between them. So I really wish you best of luck to close this gap. And I believe my intervention today is a good illustration of this fruitful collaboration. So to start with, I'm not a researcher. I'm not from the academic field, but I really use research from others on a daily basis to inform the policies I'm working on. So good policy should really be based on evidence, and finding available evidence and strong research make really our life easier. But the challenge we have is really to find evidence applied to our developing countries, because almost all the good research is conducted in developed world. So we always push to use just kind of proxies to inform our decisions. The topic of my intervention today will be the implication of public policy for businesses. So we all know for a fact that government's policy, of course, has always had a significant influence on economic growth and the new business formation. But it's really important to understand by which mechanisms these policies impact the businesses and how to evaluate their impact. So as a business manager, if I have a good understanding of this, I will be more proactive and I can adjust my business to these policies, and I will be able to plan for the long term. So I think this is a very broad topic, and if we want to cover it from all angles, we'll need absolutely more than one session to do this. But what I will try instead to do is really to focus on some key areas to illustrate this implication, leveraging mainly my experience during the last few years advising different governments in such policies. So perhaps just before I start, I will just share with you briefly my journey, as it will be perhaps helpful to give some context to some of the examples I will share along the presentation. So I started my career not in the public sector. I started my career in the private sector. So my first bachelor degree was in finance from a business school, which is LISCO, with a part of it in Neoma Business School in France. Then I pursued my master degree in investment banking and finance in France. And after that, I moved to here to the region GCC, to Qatar, to start my career in a leading investment bank. In parallel, I was pursuing my CFA certificates, achieved level 2. So everything was on track with my initial ambitions and initial plans, until on early 2011, one holiday, I came back to Morocco for a short period. But what happened during this period is that, during this period in Morocco, we had new government after the new constitutions and all that happened in 2011. And one minister was looking for someone to join his cabinet office to take care of a portfolio of some reforms impacting the financial sector and capital markets. So he was looking for someone with financial background. Someone else proposed my name. I got contacted by his office, went to meet him, wondering what's going on. So, and after a short interview with him, he proposed that I join his team. So my initial answer was like, thank you for the offer, but I'm really here just for holiday. I have my career and my plans are really not aligned with this. I'm not really ready to work with the government, public sector. And I also I'm not sure if I can really be of any added value to you. So then he said, okay, no worries, take 3 days, think about it, and then you can give us your final decision. So I think those 3 days were kind of turning point in my career, because I gave the idea another try and started seeing an opportunity on it. What if I just join for a short period of time so that I can start understanding more closely how government policies shape the financial sector and capital market? Then I'll be back to my initial work, to my initial career with those additional lenses. So I really understand how things work. So then I just made this decision, which many just think that it's a crazy move from my side, but then I just like decided to do this and told them that, okay, I'm joining you, just need to make the final arrangements with my previous job and we'll join you. So here started really my career on public policy. So I've joined the team. Then a few months later, the scope of my work changed a bit, and I was given this additional responsibility to coordinate the National Committee of Business Environment, which is in charge of not only reforms of financial sector, but the whole private sector. So this committee was co-chaired by the Prime Minister and the President of CGM, and who is representing the private sector, and it represents a public-private platform to accelerate the reforms for businesses. And we will talk more in details about this later on my intervention. And given the high priority given by the Prime Minister to this topic, then our team moved, the small team, we've been really a small team, moved then to work directly under his office. And during this period, although I was really like, my plan was to go back to financial sector, I started another master degree part-time on Islamic finance because I was seeing the opportunity on this new field. But just after 1 year, I started gradually giving up the idea of coming back to work in investment banking sector as per my initial plan, because I was really feeling every day that I found my true calling, that I have realized that the best way to make an impact is through shaping public policies. So our mission, our young team, was every day how we can work to make the life of businesses easier so that they can focus on their core activities instead just like struggling with the procedures and the regulations, and so that they can contribute more effectively to the to the development of our country. I'll talk more about this experience and what kind of work and how we've been trying to influence the private sector through our work there. But just to finish, like after 4 years, however, for family reasons, I had to quit my job to move to Saudi Arabia, and it coincided with the launch of the 2030 vision. Here. And of course, not being a Saudi, I was not really able to work directly with the government, but then I have joined the McKinsey as a public sector consultant, where I had the chance to work with different ministries in several policy areas covering the 2030 vision. And I think that was really give me another perspective, another way to do policies, another other lenses to how to tackle this. But last year I have decided to take a break and go back to school again. So because I learned public policy by practicing it, but I have never had the chance like to really have some theoretical background basis on it. So I decided to go to Oxford to pursue, to the Blavatnik School of Government to pursue a Master of Public Policy, to consolidate my knowledge on policy making and learn new tools and learn also from other experiences. So I'm just like, I've just graduated a few months ago, and then I joined now the Tony Blair Institute to work on the same field. So it's a continuity, just continue working on public policy for here in the region GCC. So we are serving governments here in the region and also some African countries. So along the presentation, I will share with you some of the learning from this journey. But what I would suggest, the structure of this presentation will be as follows. So first, I will just focus on three main categories of mechanisms of how the governments could influence the private sector. And for each category, I will try to explain briefly what is the theoretical framework to understand the mechanisms. And then to illustrate this with some examples drawn from my experience, and finally some proposals of potential areas of research. So let's start with the first category. So the three categories are based on the impact, the nature of impact they are having on business, and also if this impact is immediate or not. So we have some mechanisms that have direct impact on policy. So you can just implement this policy, you will directly feel the impact. And it will be immediate for in some cases, but in some other cases, it's not, you can't really feel it on the short term, but it will be more like medium, long term that businesses can feel all this mechanism. But the third category, and I think this is really very important because we don't really talk about it more, is all this indirect mechanism by which the government can influence businesses. So the direct is the most obvious category, immediate mechanisms. The main two levers by which governments influence businesses are the fiscal policy, monetary policy. So I know already you are familiar with this, but just like as a reminder, so we have the fiscal policy that refers to the government spending and taxation practices. So, and the fiscal policy influences the size of the company tax bill, but not only this, but it also influences the amount of money the average consumer can afford to spend, and consequently the business bottom line. So how this is how it influences the companies. And here the government could be, policy could be tight if it spends less and takes more taxes, both of which hits the bottom line of the business. If, however, the government spends more than it collects in taxes, then the fiscal policy is expansionary. Such policy can be the result of a deliberate plan to accelerate economic activities, especially when we have a crisis or like a kind of depression in the economy. So as a general rule, the more the government spends, the better of the business owner, because government spending means more government jobs, which translate to more consumer spending. On the other hand, the monetary policy, the government can influence through the interest rate or reserve requirements. So higher rates lead to decreased consumer spending, and lower interest rate will attract more investment as businesses increase their production. And I think here the current COVID-19 crisis provides a concrete example of the interplay between these two policies. So if you have noticed that the first reaction of almost all governments was to cut interest rates, to provide liquidity to the economy, where we had like a supply shock that triggers also a severe demand shock, interrupting cash flows and upsetting the payment system. So many other governments took also several fiscal measures. So if we just take the example, for example, of Morocco, just an illustration. So Morocco, the first move was through monetary policy. So the central bank reduced the policy rates by 25.2% on like on the beginning of the crisis, as early as I think it was second week or third week of March, yeah, somewhere around this date. So to support companies, and also the loan payments were suspended for SMEs and self-employed people until end of June. And the central bank also, to given the growing demand for liquidity support in the banking system, the central bank also decided on a three-pronged approach to increase the liquidity provision to the banking sector. So they mainly expand the range of collateral accepted for repos and credit guarantees. They increased and lengthened the central bank refinancing operation to support banking credits. They provided FX swaps to domestic banks, and also they give guarantees of banks so that they can issue new short-term loans to SMEs through the Central Guarantee Fund. So this is just like an idea about one recent example how really governments could quickly intervene to try to help businesses in this such situation. Also on the fiscal side, like you are all aware that in Morocco we've created this special fund dedicated to the management of the pandemic of about, I think, 2.7% of GDP or something around this. And part of it was really mainly to support the businesses and employees. So as we can see, the main driver was the monetary policy, followed then by complementary fiscal measures. But I think as we are moving to the next phase of recovery, monetary and policy, fiscal policies must swap their roles. So the latter becomes crucial, while the former must assist it without pretending to be able to act alone. And I think any insistence in relying on monetary expansion to fix the real problems of the system would prove ineffective and sustainable and really dangerous. Before moving to the next category, one final important point here for businesses to take into account while dealing with this category of measures is really to take into account the long-term effects of these policies. Because while an expansionary policy may be good news for businesses over the short term, carrying on such a policy for too long can backfire. So if the government spends more than it takes in, it must borrow to balance its books. And when government borrowing becomes excessive, interest rates tend to climb. And the higher the cost of borrowing, this could reduce investment and hiring by businesses, thereby reducing the economic activity. So this is really an important thing, because we shouldn't just focus on the short-term implication of a policy, but also on the long term. What would be this is the question that businesses should ask, like what would be the long-term implication if we carry on this kind of policies.
Sorry, Sarah, if I interrupted you, but I think you have some issues to share your presentation because we cannot see anything.
So I decided not really to go with a presentation. I don't have a presentation.
Okay.
Yeah. So because I wanted really just to share some thoughts and open it for more debate. So yeah. So the second category, so we are done now with the first category, those straightforward policies, direct and immediate impact. The second category, though, is the direct but non-immediate mechanism, non-direct, non-immediate impact. So this category, I think, it's really interesting because the mechanism here are more sustainable, as they build the foundations for a long-term positive impact on businesses. And here we are talking about the different business regulation and procedures that we can bundle all under the category of business environment. So this include rules that establish and clarify property rights, reduce the cost of resolving disputes, increase the predictability of economic interactions, and provide contractual partners with core protections against abuse, and many, many other examples how this regulation could really influence businesses. And the objective here is to have regulations designed to be efficient, accessible to all who use them, and simple in their implementation. So now there is a growing body of empirical research that explores the links between business regulation and social and economic outcomes. And the evidence suggests that regulatory reforms making it easier to start a formal business are associated with increases in the number of newly registered firms and with higher levels of employment and productivity. And conversely, overly cumbersome regulation of startups is associated with high levels of corruption and informality. And here I would like to mention like one interesting analysis that was conducted by the World Bank. They have collected data from company registries in more than 100 economies, 100 countries over 8 years. And what they found is that a simple, streamlined business startup process is really critical for fostering formal entrepreneurship. So economies, on the other hand, economies with cumbersome regulation and administrative procedures for starting a business are associated with fewer legally registered firms, greater informality, and smaller tax base, and more opportunities for corruption compared to economies with more efficient regulations. So I think this topic is really very, very important, and the implications for businesses are really huge on the mid to long term. And over the past decade, governments have increasingly been aware of the importance of this. They have increasingly understood the importance of business regulation as a driving force for their competitiveness. And they started investing heavily to improve their business environments because it becomes really a competitive advantage to attract investors. So now an investor to make a decision to invest on a country A or B, the first thing he will be looking, like among the criteria he will be looking at, how is the business environment on this country. So so really there is like this movement on the last decade of government trying to make their business environment more attractive. And here go back to the example of Morocco. Although I can be a little bit biased talking about something I was really involved in from the beginning and describe as a success story, but I think we have some evidence that support this. And the most salient one is the ranking of the country in doing business reports. So we've been one of the objectives also of this committee was to improve the ranking of the country on this doing business reports. So the CNEA, which is the Comité National de l'Environnement des Affaires, this committee was set up in 2010. So it's been now 10 years from its creation. So when it was set up, our ranking was 128. So we were really among the worst countries in the world in terms of business environment. And this year, we are at 53, only 3 ranks away from the government's objective to be in the top 50. And if we compare our performance against the performance of other African countries, we had so far the best performance during the last decade. So our ranking in the continent was 14 after many other countries in 2010, such South Africa, Tunisia, Botswana, and other countries. But this year we are the 3rd in Africa after only Mauritius Island and Rwanda. And we improved our ranking by 75 ranks. And the second best performance was Kenya, which is really lower than us. They had an improvement of 39 over the same period. So really Morocco made the business environment as its top priority during the last decade. And this was achieved because of the important reforms adopted during this period in terms of new business regulations, new laws, and also in terms of streamlining of business procedures. and the setup of different digital platforms to make the life of businesses easier. But what is more interesting about this experience is not only what has been achieved, but also how this was achieved. And I think this is exactly what is making this experience successful and very unique, because the success factor of this experience was a collaborative work between the public and the private sector. So the idea is that we are not only working for the private sector, but we are working with the private sector from the very beginning of the reform process. So as I mentioned earlier, this committee is co-chaired by the Prime Minister and the presidents of CGM representing private sector, meeting like on a regular basis. And we have committees in CGM and governments working on a daily basis together. So we work from the beginning of the process to identify first the priorities of the private sector together, to set the annual action plan together. And also the private sector play a role in the implementation process to make sure it's on track with their expectation, because sometimes what happens is like you can have like an idea, start implementing it, but at the end when you implementing it, you will realize that it's not really answering the needs of the private sector. So it's good to have like someone from the private sector along the journey to make sure that along the process there you are checking that you are on track and you are really responding to the real needs of the private sector. And it's a really fruitful collaboration and has showed over this years the power of public and private stakeholders working together. And this is an important model, and I think it really needs a dedicated session to study it thoroughly. But for the sake of time, I will move to the next session. But before that, I would like to let you with some few ideas about some topics of research. So we know that many reforms have been done, but what would be interesting in terms of research is really to do an impact evaluation of this regulation. So we don't have exact evidence in Morocco about how the improvements of business environment translate into new businesses, how it translates into new investments, and how it can make companies more profitable because they have more streamlined procedures. They can focus more on their core businesses. So I think that will be really very helpful to have some evidence around this and to have some research to support this, because this will really help inform the future policy decisions. And also it will help to set the priorities accordingly to, like, if we find like some regulation have more impact than others, or so I think this could be a very interesting topic area of research. And I think also another important topic, since you are Africa Business School, would be to study the different models of, across African countries. So many African countries have also made great progress during the last decade while adopting different models. And so it would be interesting to really compare all these models and to see how really they influence the businesses. And by the way, many African countries were interested really in the Moroccan model. So they've been sending delegation to learn from our experience, and we've been really exchanging with the different governments. And just like 2 weeks ago, I was contacted from someone working with the Côte d'Ivoire government, asking if I can propose someone from Morocco that worked on business environment to come for like a period of time to assist the government in Côte d'Ivoire to set up also this kind of model and like to kickstart the business environment work there. So I will stop here. I will move to the last section, the last category, because I'm aware of time and I really want to have more time for interaction with you. So the last mechanism are the indirect mechanism. So we covered now two mechanisms, but both of them are direct. But just it's matter of if they are immediate or not non-immediate. Now, the third category, which is the less obvious, are some mechanism. I will just like tackle some mechanisms that are indirect and that have mainly the negative impacts on businesses, because more efforts to stimulate business creation and expansion have been in the form of direct mechanisms so far that we have presented earlier. And so if we want to stimulate business, first thing that governments will do is just cutting rates, implementing tax incentives, looking for some regulation to reform, looking some procedures to streamline. But while those mechanisms could be very helpful, other sometimes very subtle policy factors can be more enticing. And chief among them is the policy predictability. And by this we mean an environment in which a medium to long-term assessment of government policy is possible. Unfortunately, we don't really have evidence from our countries, and this is why I will just use the US example here. So in the US, for example, the lack of policy visibility in a politically divided nation during the last few years and the fear of new regulation, taxes, and rent seeking by lobbying groups is really having a very negative impact on new business creation. So policy uncertainty has grown in the United States as the polarization of the electorate has intensified. And so we can really focus on the direct impact of policies, who will lose benefits, who will see their taxes increases, but we forget the high cost of policy uncertainty on the economy. So uncertainty about the short run and the long run of fiscal policy can cause large falls in consumption and investments and outputs and have depressed economies across the globe. And business can delay their investments and hiring just because of this uncertainty. And here there is an interesting study that determined that the rise of uncertainty from 2006 to 2011 in the US cut employment by as many as 2.3 million jobs and industrial production by up to 4%. And the fiscal policy, including taxes, government spending, accounted for 40% of policy-related economic uncertainty. And the monetary policy accounted for 33% of that diminution. And 2/3 of the 22% drop in corporate investment observed during the period between 2007 and 2009 crisis period can be attributed to just policy-related uncertainty, not to because problem of cash liquidity, no, but just because of problem of uncertainty. So this is really like how policy could really impact negatively the businesses, and this is something that we can't really feel, but immediately we can't really see. So I think it's a really very important topic to look at, because it has huge implication for businesses. And really, from my experience, I have seen how investors really value visibility and predictability more than anything else. So investors, especially like foreign investors, sometimes they don't have really issues with paying more taxes, paying more like rates, if of course if it's still like sustainable for them, as long as they have like visibility about the policy in the country. So we had like when I was still in the Moroccan government, whenever there is a new delegation from foreign investors coming to the country, they will schedule a meeting with us. So it was like the first thing they will ask, like they need to have visibility about what is our plan, what are the regulations that will change, what are the policies that we have on the pipeline, not only on the short term, but they really need to have visibility along like for the next 5 years, what will change, because only by knowing this, they can then adjust their plans accordingly. And this is, I think, another very interesting topic for research to highlight the importance of this factor for government to push them to be more predictable. And just throwing here an idea, you can even build like kind of policy predictability index that determine what are the factors that could contribute to the predictability, and to compare countries accordingly, and also how the correlation between this index and like businesses. So I think that could be a very interesting topic, because this is something we don't really cover in the policy area. The second indirect mechanism, to close my intervention, is also something that really I came across through my experience, and I was like trying to find a name for it, but it's the unintended consequences for other policies on businesses. So this can have really huge implication for business. So the governments could implement a policy with no intention to harm businesses, but then after the implementation, they will realize that this policy had impacted badly the businesses, at least in the short term. And the problem here is that the initial evaluation of the impact was not done properly, or not done at all. And the negative spillover effects on businesses were neglected. And here we'll give a concrete example from Saudi Arabia. So as part of their 2030 vision, they have launched very ambitious projects and reforms to diversify their economy and increase their non-oil revenues. And among the reforms they have adopted, there was the nationalization reform, the Saudization reform. So to encourage hiring Saudis over expats. So they have implemented the expat levy, which means that a private sector entities will be charged a high monthly levy for each expat employee. So this is just like a way to push them to just like hire more Saudis instead of expats, which is good for the economy. So the intentions of the reform were really good, to increase employment among their nationals, among Saudis, to build a national workforce instead of relying just on expats. But the result after less than 1 year of implementing that was on companies was that companies were forced to fire expats because they can't really afford the taxes. This levy tax is very high, with no necessarily adequate replacement from Saudis. And even if they want to hire Saudis, they need to pay higher salaries, and their productivity, especially on this learning phase, is generally less. So this led to direct impacts of the cost of their production. On the other hand, thousands of expats were forced to leave the country because they just lost their jobs, and in turn has led to a critical decrease in the internal demand, which has impacted severely the bottom line of companies. So the overall implication of this policy on businesses were really dramatic. So the government has called then our team to come to design some new initiatives to help the private sector cope with the situation. So we started designing some funds for struggling companies and impacted businesses to help save jobs in the economy. But it was very late, because already thousands of companies have already defaulted, thousands of jobs were lost. And all this happened because we haven't taken into account the unintended consequences for our policies. So instead of being proactive in dealing with the situation, the government was more reactive. And again, here, I think this is another area of research that could be very interesting and useful, to come up with kind of an analytical framework of unintended consequences of policies on businesses that could be used as a policy evaluation tool that policymakers can use whenever they are designing a new policy, so that they capture this from the beginning. And even if they need to take such policies to make such decisions, what they can do at least to design from the beginning some coping mechanisms, some coping strategies, so to help businesses deal with the new situation, because sometimes the governments, they don't have other choices, so it's hard trade-offs to make. So they will necessarily have an impact, negative impacts on the economy. But at least if we think upfront about the consequences, we can be more proactive on this. So I think those are the three main categories. There are many other ways in which like governments could influence businesses, but I wanted really to focus on these three main areas where I see some opportunities of research very interesting. And to just conclude, I would like to conclude with an opening to another topic rather than a conclusion. So an opening to a new topic which could constitute a great opportunity of research for you, and which is the role of state in innovation and how our country could become an entrepreneurial state to drive innovation. So this is another topic that perhaps we can spend another session to discuss it. But a good starting point would be, so I have here a book that I'm reading this period. It's really very, very interesting. Its name is The Entrepreneurial State, the Banking Public and Private Sector Myths by Mariana Mazzucato, and in which she points out the big role governments play in creating innovative businesses. And she used different case studies from different innovation fields to make her points. So if we just take the example of Apple, Mariana argues that Apple's success would have been impossible without the active role of the state. So every technology that makes the iPhone so smart was government funded, from internet, GPS, its touch screen display, and voice-activated Siri. So, for example, the armed forces in the US pioneered the internet, GPS positioning, and voice-activated virtual assistants. They also provided much of the early funding for Silicon Valley. Academic scientists in publicly funded universities and labs developed the touch screen and the HTML language. And also government's body even lent Apple $500,000 before it went public. So she argues that the private sector only finds the courage to invest after an entrepreneurial state has made the high-risk investment. And she made the point that the state has not only fixed market failures, but also actively shaped and created new markets by taking risks. So this is so one area of research could be to find out how this could apply to our context and how our state could play a more active role in fostering innovation by transitioning into an entrepreneurial state, away from the traditional roles that it plays to influence businesses. So with this entrepreneurial spirit, the floor is yours, open to questions, brainstorm ideas, learn from your experiences as well. And thank you for your attendance.
Thank you so much. I have a reflection and a question also. So I'm Umayma. I'm PhD scholar from African Business School. I have a little experience also about the public policy, and I found that we have a problem between the interaction between the government and the parliament, and some public policies they have too much problems and gaps, and we don't. And we don't take on consideration all the stakeholders, especially in business. And even for me, I saw that it needs some reflection and needs some research about this. And also about the last thing that you said about the government should be like investor, like an entrepreneur for markets. I agree with this, and actually we need to change the mindset of risk. And I think that the mindset of risk, it can be changed if the government or if the state in general can be changed also. So and this can catalyze the change and all the investment that we can have in the country. So this is how I see the things. And also about this, we should change the standards about the public policy in Morocco. And if we take if we take the theory of innovation in public policies, it will change a lot. And I see also if, for example, I lost my idea. I see, for example, if all the ministries take, for example, the recommendation of les Cours de compte, because they give amazing recommendation about how the public policies they failed, especially in business, in many programs for investments, and they're really huge programs that should be operational.
Sarah,
but we have
suggest you to give some topics which the business people can relate in public policy research, and likewise they can connect business and public policy interventions. And if you can guide some, it will be so helpful for the students to understand.
Yes. Perfect. Yes, so first, thank you, Umayma, for your reflection. So for your first point, yeah, you are absolutely right. So I think we have this problem in the policy making in Morocco. So the CNEA, the example that I give of the CNEA is really, it's an exception. Like, because, and we really wanted to make it a role model, like for other, how we can make policies. And we've seen the impact of working with all the stakeholders. And when I say really working with all the stakeholders, not excluding anyone from the stakeholders, private sector, professionals. So we had like the 50% of our time will be just consultation with all the stakeholders to make sure like the policies we are making are really responding to their needs. But unfortunately, this model is not applied like in all the policy areas. So we've been trying to kind of export this model to other the other areas, but we still now we were not really very successful on doing this. So you have policy makers on their offices doing like designing policies without really like consulting with other stakeholders. So I think this is really, I think, something that needs to be changed. And you mentioned something on your second point, which is really important, which is the shift of mindset. And I think this applies not only to shift to an entrepreneurial mindset, but it also applies to your first points, because it's just like the way policy making, like they are used to make their policies. So to really change this, to really change the paradigm, you need to have this shift in the mindset. So just to go back to the research areas, perhaps I will summarize again some of the ideas that I have mentioned on the different topics that I have mentioned. So the first topic of I have mentioned. So the first topic was the impact of the business environment into businesses, because we don't have evidence about this. We don't have like of a regulation X how it really impacts the businesses. So this is a very interesting topic of research that could inform the policy decisions to make their policies and priorities really according to the needs and what work best for the private sector. So that was the first proposal. First proposal is really a research on the link, the correlation we have. Sorry. Okay. So we have evidence from other countries. We have evidence but unfortunately in Morocco, in African countries, we don't have such evidence. So we are just working, but we don't know to which extent this is really impactful for our businesses. The second thing, and it is related to also your point, Umayma, is this the models, the study of the models. So we have different models in Africa, in African countries. So in our model is a public-private model. So it has its pros and cons. Perhaps it will delay the process, but you are making sure that you are implementing their point of views from the beginning of process. Some other government will go with, okay, it's a public model. So and perhaps this will have other implication on businesses. So I think this is also another topic of research area that could be really interesting, is to study the different models and to study how these models could shape the policies and could really have different implication on businesses. So the what, the first question is like the what on this correlation, and here is more the how we do things. Third research area of that I suggested is this predictability index, policy predictability index. So I mentioned how important policy index predictability could really influence businesses, and I give like some data from the US, but we don't have such evidence from our countries. So I think building an index around this is just an idea, but I think that could be really very powerful. So we can rank countries, we can just start like on small few countries in Africa, but then this index could then expand to other countries, and could be, why not, Africa Business School like really launching this index on internationally, and it could be like a reference on policy predictability index. So that was my third suggestion of research area. The third one was the fourth one was to come up with an analytical framework for the unintended consequences of policies on businesses. So just how we can make this, it's more about the impact evaluation of all these unintended consequences of policies. So what would be the best analytical framework that policymakers could use to make sure whatever policies on other areas they are making are not really harmful for businesses. So this is another really very interesting topic of research. And finally, the fifth area of research could be just around this idea of entrepreneurial state, how in Morocco, in African countries, we can really shift to states could really play a more active role in fostering innovation by transitioning into this kind of entrepreneurial state. And I highly recommend this book, so you can, it's a good starting point to think about the topic and its implications. So those are five main.
Shara, there is a question coming from Benima Mohammed, and she's asking the question like, is the legal environment in Morocco is exactly a kind of creating hurdle or a kind of providing congenial atmosphere for the investment? So whether the legal system is good enough to attract proper investment to Morocco or not.
So
connected to public policy.
Yes. So the short answer would be yes and no. So and here I think a huge progress was made here in this area, exactly on the legal environment. So because on the committee, on the CNEA National Business Committee, we're working on two things. So we've been working on the legal environment, all the laws, the regulations that impacts like the businesses, and also the other side of it is the procedures, how we can make the procedures easier, streamlining procedure, digital platforms and everything. And the legal, I should say that the legal part of it, the regulation, was the most challenging part of all the reforms. So we've been like, we tried really to make a lot of reforms, but it's not always easy. But we've made a lot of progress, and that those legal reforms that were translated after into our ranking on the business. So I will just give you some examples. So we have the law for companies, la SARL. So that was implemented a few years ago, and that's this law had like a huge impact on the first indicator of doing business, which is creating business. More recently, I think 2 years ago, the SA law. So and that was really like it took really years to implement and to get this new law approved, and it's mainly affect the protection of investors and also impacting the protection of minor investors. And but now it was adopted. The other law that was just adopted last year, and with the decrees adopted only this year, like only a few months ago, is the movable asset law. And this is a very interesting law for financing of businesses. So there are several like improvements in this field, in this area of legal environments. But I agree, this is we have a lot of hurdles here, and the CNEA, what they are not trying to do, they have like a new strategy. They are trying to change the legal procedure, how to get this laws done more quickly, because the process now is really taking forever, like the parliament, and so it took years. So all the reforms that were adopted like last year, 2 years ago, I started them with the team when I was there 5 years ago, and they have just been adopted. So it's really like an ongoing process, but there are some improvements. I think we have some more questions here.
Coming up from Kautar Benjati, and she's asking about the questions like the policy connected with technology. How does the public policies influence the use of technology and technological innovations in a country and in a business?
So this is why I said, like, I think we have to answer this question. There's two things. So what should be done and what is done in like leading innovation countries, and to really now like to have a good sense of how the state is playing a role on this all kind of innovation. I think this book is really very interesting, very a good starting point. It's really changed the perspective, like not only in terms of funding, but taking high risk investment, starting like some new ideas, like funding the lab researchers. Research labs in universities, like many things in terms of not only funding, but also in terms of new policies, new regulation to do this. The second part of it, what is really what exactly is done in our context. So I'm not sure that we are there. Yeah, there are some effort here and there to encourage innovation, but I think a lot needs to be done to really move to this more entrepreneurial state that really foster the innovation and help like building this economy around innovation.
There is a question from Turkey. Ms. Hajar is asking a question. She's a PhD student at Eastern Mediterranean University, Turkey. And she's talking about, she's interested in impact of government policies on higher education field policies. The first question is about the topics that need to be investigated in this area, public policy, that many critics have been revealed amid the coronavirus outbreak. So she's trying to ask a question, how the coronavirus outbreak is connected to public policies, and what are the topics which we can come up. And the second, kindly share the beginner researchers, what are your advices in terms of acquiring that knowledge in an environment with an abundant amount of information. So one is connected to Corona, another is connected to the abundance of information, how you can build up proper policies, and she expects some suggestions from you.
Sorry, so there are two questions, right? One about Corona. I missed, so this is Hajar, this is the question from Hajar, so just I can read it here. On higher education field, okay. So first question is about topics that need to be investigated in this area, especially that many critics have been revealed amid the coronavirus. But I didn't get, if she can clarify her question, like what kind of critics, like critics in which area exactly?
Hajar, I may request you to just voice out if you are still on platform.
Yes. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Hajar.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your knowledge, Mrs. Sarah. My first question is actually about topics that, as a PhD student, I can. I can discuss or make research about. It's related to the impact of public policy on higher education policies.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a beginner researcher, so that I'm just looking for topics in that area.
Okay.
Okay, and my second question is about your advices for beginner researcher. I mean, how to get the right knowledge, especially that, as you know, abundant amount of information are around us. So, how to select?
Okay, perfect. Now it's clear. So, for your first question about topics, some interesting topics that could be on this field, higher education, I will just share with you one topic one field which could be really very relevant is the application of behavioral science into higher education. So this is like more broadly topic, like we can apply it on different policies, and it is really a new topic, the application of how we can really apply behavioral science and into policies, and especially on the education. So I've been working like recently on this specific topic, and I think among the areas where really behavioral insight could be applied is on the education and on higher education. And there are lots of research recently on this field, and that could be an interesting topic of research. I can like give you more like details. We can discuss it offline after. But one reference would be just to start thinking about this, and this is for everybody also. It's the nudge book. So the nudge book, nudging, is a new theory, and the co-author of it like won a Nobel Prize 2 years ago, and it's just bringing a new perspective to public policy. And it's how we can, starting from the idea that we are not really rational economics as the traditional economic theory like just assume, but we are human. So they wrote this book, The Nudge. They had this theory, the nudge theory, and now governments, and starting from David Cameron in 2010, he launched this the nudge unit in the UK, and since then this topic started to really get momentum in application on different policy areas, and especially on the education. So now in the UK, the first department that has its own nudge unit or behavioral insight unit is the education, and especially on higher education, the application are huge. So this is one topic I think really very new, and that could be a very interesting topic for research. For your second question about knowledge, so acquiring knowledge, I think so. First of all, I'm not really a researcher, so I can learn from you. You are the researchers, but I think it's really important. As I mentioned at the beginning of my intervention, it's really interesting to get close to the reality, just like from news, from what happened in the world. So, and try to get what are the trends. And the trends are changing. And as you said, you mentioned the COVID. The COVID will really change a lot of things. So we are the post-COVID area where will be so much different from the pre-COVID phase. So I think listening to this new trends, following what's going on, rather than just like reading books, research. I think this could be very helpful for researchers to to just stay in touch with the reality, and to whenever you are solving a problem, to make sure that you are solving a problem that would make the life easier in the world, and not just like solving hypothetical problems. So that would be my only advice on this. Not sure which other questions
One question, Zara, is connected to the language, connected to the French culture, French administrative things, and likewise. So they're asking a question whether it is a conducive environment through this legacy of French administration to attract the foreign investment from English speaking or Anglophone or worldwide. Is it a stumble block?
Yeah, so I think this is really an important topic, and unfortunately we are still stuck in the our administration with the French, although like all the word now is like really English, and I like from my experience in the government, people were really like we had always these delegations from foreign investors, but unfortunately people even in the administration, so people who have really the knowledge and technical expertise, they can't really be the like just explain this because there's this language barrier. So they will they were like calling us every time, like this young team that we've been able to kind of speak English, so to just make this the translation, and it's you feel like the language was really a real barrier on this. So there've been few initiatives just like trying to do something around like the translation and making things more available in English, but we are still like very far away from this. But yeah, you are right. This is a really hurdle. So in our countries and other African countries as well. Professor, if you can just, which other question can we tackle?
Okay, there is a question, it's like, does research include the facilities and relaxation in Morocco government policies of foreign investment and likewise? There is a question like that. Mr. Kamaran Sultan is asking, does research include the facilities and relaxation in Morocco government policies for foreign investment?
Think about it. We are
the facilities and the relaxation in Morocco government. Which research do you mean? I didn't really get the question. So if you can, Kamran, just explain your question. So
I may invite Kamaran to just elaborate it so that Sarah can understand it and explain it. Okay, there is no voice from the side. So there is one question: what are the regulations amid COVID crisis that made by the public policy to help the agriculture and non-reformed sectors?
The regulation for the agricultural sector. So I will just share my perspective, but I'm not sure. Perhaps I would share like we've been working like few weeks ago with two governments here in GCC region about this topic exactly. So the topic is more related to the food security, because now with COVID, there is a huge problem with food security, and because the supply chain were disrupted and like many problems around this. So here, especially that governments and countries who are heavily dependent on agriculture, this is a real challenge for them. So if I take here the example of the UAE, 90% of their food is imported. So and they one thing they are really accelerating right now is really the policies around the agriculture, and what they are trying to do. The focus now is on the agri-tech. And just like 3 weeks ago, there was like a fund, a dedicated fund to just fund the startups on the agri-tech, and they dedicated like for each $1 million for the startups. So they funded 4 startups just like this, like 3 weeks ago, and they are pushing like things towards this now more and more, the agri-tech. So I think huge changes will happen on this side. So countries are more aware of the importance of their food security, and agriculture is the key, because whatever crisis, international crisis, global crisis happen, that could really make their food supply chain like at risk. So they really need to invest more on. So my sense of the, like, especially countries who are heavily dependent on imports for their food, there will be a lot of changes on the agriculture, on their agricultural strategies, and the push towards more agri-tech and more innovation on this field.
One question is connected to innovation policy. It is Mr. Itabi is asking one question: how can we set up a knowledge management policy for innovation?
How we can learn from the COVID?
How can we set up a knowledge management policy for innovation, whether it is existing or not, or do we have to really develop a policy or think about a policy for innovation, knowledge management linking innovation?
So I think there are absolutely, like in the context of Morocco, like policies around innovation. So there have been like many policies around innovation, but I think the question now is really we need to we need to evaluate all these policies. We need to, because we have a problem, like this is a general problem, not only general problem, not only on innovation, but on many other policies. It's like we can design beautiful policies, we can implement many policies, but we don't evaluate them. So we don't really have a sense of if this policies works or not. And I think this is also like one area of research that could be really interesting, because now there are new tools of evaluating policies. So we are more and more using the RCTs on evaluating policies on other countries, but this is something that we don't use really here in Morocco. So the RCTs and other new tools to evaluating these policies, this would be the first step on innovation or in other policies, to really first what has been done, how was it, and how successful this was, and learn from this to build like as a continuity new policies and the new strategies are around this.
One question is connected to the allocation of funds and the policy. Nesrin Tari is asking a question: do you think that the allocated funds to encourage entrepreneurship in Morocco before the COVID crisis, which are going to be relocated to food security and other kind of priorities? So is there any chance for reduction of funds to entrepreneurship with due consideration to COVID?
Yeah, so this is really an important question. So I think this will really depend on the importance of the areas to which these funds were allocated. For sure, not only in Morocco, but everywhere in the world now, there is huge fiscal constraint with all this COVID. This COVID is really creating a lot of fiscal constraints. So the governments absolutely after COVID will reprioritize a lot of their funds allocation to allocate them to the most priority sectors, and they will be constrained to make a lot of changes. And this is not only in Morocco, and I'm working here, our work on a daily basis now with the governments here in the region, Saudi, UAE, and other countries here in the region, and which are like oil countries, but now they have really very fiscally constrained, and we are doing all this exercise of reprioritization on a daily basis. So lots of things will change, but what is sure is some opportunities will emerge as well. So as I mentioned, like the UAE, even in this fiscally constrained phase, but they have allocated not only the previous funds, but more funds to the agri-tech startup, because now this becomes one top priority. I imagine whatever was allocated to the ed-tech as well will be a priority. Whatever allocated to medical, whatever supplies or something will be a priority. So, but of course, if some funds were allocated to something which is not priority, there's a great chance that this will be repurposed in the near future. And this happens everywhere now in the world. The repurposing of funds is something that governments are trying to use a mechanism to just kind of cope with their fiscal constraints.
The last question, Sarah. We know that you have taken too much of time exactly explaining the things, but this is the last question asking about the FDI regulations by Salma. And she's telling about Morocco has gone through many kind of macroeconomic adjustments and structural reforms. Mm-hmm. But you know, in comparison with African countries, and she's exactly asking, could you make any comparative analysis of different FDI policies across African markets? Just a perspective of you.
Yeah, so so to be honest, like these questions, to really give this kind of comparative analysis, I can't really answer it here. First of all, because I'm not really an expert on the African market. So yeah, I can share some very general ideas, but to really have this comparative analysis and across all these African countries is not really something that I can do here. But I'm really happy to exchange with you. If this is your topic area of research, I'm really happy to exchange with you on how we can do the analysis of this question.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much for coming down to this short interaction with our research scholars and inducing a vision towards what kind of research topics, what kind of policy related topics you can engage into. And you have been given wonderful insight on Moroccan public policy system in comparison with the international level. And we are happy to inform you that we are very joyous on your, what you would say, your interaction. And I hope your mentorship will be continued with the students at the individual level, and hope the COVID situation will be moving away. And one day you will be visiting our campus and interacting with the students face to face. And I'm so thankful on the behalf of Africa Business School. I'm so thankful to you.
I'm really, it's like all my pleasure to interact with all this scholars and researchers. I'm really looking forward to meet all you in person, and please you can reach out to me whenever you want. So perhaps the school could share my contact detail. I will be really happy to have individual chats with you, to just brainstorm about your topics, share my perspective, learn from you as well. So that would be my pleasure. It's always good. I'm always happy to go back to school. So I love school, and I'm always that make me happy to go back to school.
Thank you so much, Sarah. God bless you, and stay healthy and stay what you would say with your all spirit of knowledge, and keep in touch also. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Great day.